Okay, everyone, this is podcast number 4. So we have our last and special guest. So if you can introduce yourself and just kind of talk about some of the questions I mentioned earlier.
So my name is Dov Wilker. I am the regional director of American Jewish Committee's Atlanta office. I've been in Atlanta for around 15 years now, originally from New Jersey. As I mentioned, I work for an organization called the American Jewish Committee. So sort of Judaism is in the work that I do every single day. We are a Jewish advocacy organization, which means that we engage with ethnic and religious leaders, political and diplomatic leaders, in an effort to create a better understanding about who we are as a Jewish community and who our community partners are, be it religious, ethnic, international, or political. And I should say that, in addition to my work, I lead a very Jewishly oriented life. A number of years ago, my wife and I moved to Israel and we became Israeli citizens. I went to Jewish day school, which is a Jewish private school. I went to Jewish high school. I went to Jewish summer camp. I belonged to a synagogue. Whenever we would travel around the world, we would always visit, a synagogue or the Jewish museum as a way to sort of understand the evolving nature of the Jewish community in those places. My children here go to Jewish day school. We belong to a synagogue. So I guess you could say I lead a very Jewish life. But on the other hand, for many, I'm not the most observant Jewish person, meaning I don't follow all of the laws. Or I follow many, but it's sort of it's the laws that I feel comfortable with following. So I tell people that, there's a joke that we have that says, if you ask a Jewish person, you have two Jews, there's three opinions. I tell people that you can always find a rabbi across the denominational spectrum who will agree with the choices that you're making and make a Jewish decision based off of that. I'm very fortunate. Thank you very much, Beata, for having me on your podcast and for today's conversation.
Thank you. And I had a question because you mentioned about living in Israel. So how did that differ living in America, being Jewish, and then living in Israel? And how long did you live there?
Yeah, so I lived there for a total of 5 years, over probably a 7-year period. It's significantly different. Judaism in Israel is a part of your daily life.
Yes.
You can, when you live in Jerusalem, so I keep kosher, which is I follow certain dietary laws. And, in Israel, the law is that restaurants have to be kosher. And if they're not, then they have to pay like an extra special license in order to not be. Yeah. And so, Friday night for Shabbat, like all public transportation stops. As we said to someone, your taxi driver is Jewish, your bus driver is Jewish, the police officer is Jewish. The things that the janitors are Jewish. I mean, really, like everybody is Jewish. And although Israel is a very diverse country where 20% of the population is not Jewish, it almost goes without saying. So you don't have to practice being Jewish, right? The investment that you make in how you participate religiously is very different than it is in the United States. So here, we go to synagogue in pre-COVID times fairly regularly because we felt that was, it was something that we wanted to do. But in Israel, it was never part of our consciousness because we were living being Jewish. You're reminded. Exactly. You're infused with that. It's a great way of saying it. And Jewish history is around you, here in Georgia. Like if you want to see Jewish history, there's a few places that you go to. But in Israel, if you want to see Jewish history, all you have to do is step out the door. The names of the streets in Tel Aviv and in many places throughout the country have little descriptors, like 5-10 words about what it means. And through that, you're able to understand, greater sense of Jewish history, greater sense of Israeli history. So it's sort of a part of everything that we do.
Yeah. It sounds like it's way more accommodating than living in America.
Oh, well, that's an understatement. I mean, we
Yeah.
every like it's funny that in America, right? Holiday, our calendar really it's on a Judeo-Christian calendar, right? So we have
Hmm.
you have off for Christmas and the Christmas break and everybody knows Good Friday and Easter Sunday. Whereas in Israel, right, you have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur off days and Passover. Everybody takes off, and the month of whenever the Jewish holidays in the fall take place, like the month that you get nothing done because people are traveling, they're visiting family. It's just known and recognized
Hmm.
as sort of a time where things don't get done because it follows a Jewish calendar. And in fact, I'm not sure if you know this, but we have in Judaism, there's a slightly different calendar than the Gregorian calendar that we use. So today is April 27th,
Hmm.
2021. Let's see, today's Hebrew date is the 15th of ER in the year 5781. So there are oftentimes like
Wow.
your official documents will include the Jewish date as well as the Gregorian date.
I never
So yeah,
knew
it's
that.
everywhere.
That can
Yeah.
confuse me though.
Yeah. Israeli national anthem doesn't have anything specifically Jewish, although it is inferred by the words that are used. But it
Hmm.
doesn't say anything about being the Jewish homeland. It talks about sort of living in a free land.
Hmm. Okay.
So things are very different.
Would you ever take your kids to Israel?
Oh, absolutely. So my older daughter went when she was 7 months old, and we're talking about when we're
Oh,
going to go back with my younger daughter. Sadly, it's been too long since my wife and I have been back. So
yeah.
but traveling. I mean, the first trip that I ever went overseas was to Israel, and we
Mhm.
believe that that's really me and my family believe that that's very important to us.
Yes. And it sounds
Mm.
very impactful and a huge influence on just your life and your perspective. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And in fact, one of the other things about it, in part because my children go to a Jewish school here in Atlanta,
Hmm.
the I was speaking with an Israeli family that moved here, and we welcome them with open arms. Shockingly, we have no friends in common from Israel, but part of the connection that we have is our shared love of Israel and the notion of Zionism, and that really the notion of Zionism is truly a positively impactful project and issue that enables Jews from around the world to be connected.
Hmm.
So it's something that it's not just about the religion, but it's also about culture. It's about our diversity, and it's also about this notion of support for a Jewish homeland.
Yeah. And that's what I have heard in all the podcasts when I have interviewed people from the community, that the unity is so strong that it doesn't matter like
Mm-hmm.
where you come from. Everyone in every podcast has said the unity. It just like it doesn't matter.
Yep.
Like y'all are just automatically glued together. So that's like
Yep.
so
I mean,
beautiful.
it is. It's funny. Like if you think about like the moment that you meet, there's this thing called Jewish geography. I don't know if somebody else told you about
Yes.
this, but you can, right? We have 6 degrees. We're no more than 6 degrees separated from anybody. And I
Hmm.
had a friend who was visiting from New York the other day, and she's like, "Oh, you know this person, and I know that person, and we happen to know these random people in common, and it's all because we're Jewish."
Jeez, it's a small world.
Yep,
And then
that's
my
right.
next question I wanted to ask too is, what are some cultural considerations we should know about if we do not belong to the Jewish community, particularly for like counselors? I know you're not a counselor, but
Right.
if you are working with a Jewish client or anything we should know.
Yeah. Look, so I, I think it's important to understand that the people practice Judaism in very different ways.
Hmm.
If you have a client that's Jewish, it's often fair to ask, what level of observance do they have? That will determine, what they are comfortable with, what type of engagement they might have. So, if they're an Orthodox person, meaning that they're probably more strict, they might not want to schedule an appointment on a Friday afternoon, right? Because
Hmm.
Shabbat is coming, and I think many people might not perhaps want to spend a Friday afternoon because of what they might have to do to get Shabbat ready. Recognizing Jewish holidays. Again, we're very diverse people. So for some people, the Jewish holidays are really important. For some of them, it's not. Um, you know, the I would say that those are probably the most important things. Sadly, many Jewish people have experienced anti-Semitism in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's, someone saying something to them, either ignorantly, that is anti-Semitic. Someone saying something intentionally anti-Semitic. I was speaking with a woman yesterday. Thankfully, this doesn't really exist anymore, but she was applying to law firms in another southern city in the early 1980s. They said, "Look, you're really qualified, but we don't hire Jews at this firm." And they didn't. They said that to her. She actually had it said to me that there were two law firms that said that to her. And this is 1981. Yeah. And I'm certain that it probably went on until the 90s even. And they didn't think of themselves as being necessarily anti-Semitic. They just didn't want Jews there. Or the second one, she actually said that, people often ask, I shouldn't say often, but people have asked to meet a Jewish person because they want to see where their horns might be. So there are lots of, there are lots of little things that the people who are asking this question don't necessarily think of as anti-Semitic. They've just never met a Jewish person before. So it ranges from things like that to, violence, being beaten, swastikas being spray painted on their home or, on their children's school books because people are really being vehemently anti-Semitic. But again, from a counselor's perspective, I think it's most important to be aware of sort of what the individual sensitivities might be to their religion, what experiences that they might have had that has impacted who they are today, and that can be different also if they're from a small town versus a big city. So if you're from Wichita, Kansas versus New Jersey, you're going to have very different experiences.
Yes.
Being Jewish and how you relate and how you respond. But I also believe, there are even those, there are things such as shaking hands, right? There are men who won't touch women. There are women who won't touch men, even shaking their hands. And so you would know if someone's more observant, just perhaps from the way that they dress, about whether or not that is something that they would consider. But that there is in Atlanta, there's a large community of people who won't shake hands with someone from the opposite sex. And it's nothing against who you are. They might be polite the first time. But if you are treating clients from within that community, that is something to be aware of. And again, that's a very small part of the Jewish community, but it's still, still 3,000 people in Atlanta like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And not to take offense to it, because that's just something that they practice.
Exactly. Exactly. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think the holidays, Shabbat, and sort of the touching or the biggest things that I can think of.
Yeah, and I know it's such a broad question. I just like to hear like the different perspectives as I am a counselor. So I know I think I shared with you like I have worked with Jewish clients, but unfortunately I never knew how to approach the situation. And since the podcast, I realized like y'all are still human beings. y'all just do things differently, but it's not like different from what I do. There's more similarities and differences. So
exactly. And I think that's the most important thing to remember, right? Like nobody is going to be offended. Nobody is going to be offended if you ask a question, right? Like they want to be able to be helpful. They want to be able to be they want to be able to share with you their experiences and their opinions. And I got to believe that they're going to see a counselor for a specific reason. So that sort of means that they're probably more willing to share about themselves and their experiences than others who aren't.
Mm-hmm. And then my next question is, how can we get involved or advocate for the Jewish community, and just without being offensive, though?
Yeah. So look, I don't actually believe that you can be. I mean, you can only be offensive if you insult somebody. I think that advocacy on behalf of the Jewish community takes many different forms. There is federal legislation, there is state and local legislation, but I think most importantly, it's about helping communities understand the needs of the Jewish community. So, it could be oftentimes, schools, universities and schools schedule things on major Jewish holidays, right? Like that is insensitive. Election days. I was speaking with a rabbi earlier, and for observant Jews who don't drive or work on Shabbat on Saturdays, the notion of voting on Saturday is an anathema. So helping to advocate to local elected officials for Sunday voting doesn't just benefit, it benefits a segment of the Jewish community just as much as it benefits others in the community. Food availability of food services. I know security is a big deal. There's a thing called the nonprofit security grants, which the federal government has, which doesn't just benefit synagogues or Jewish institutions, but it's a way to help protect those communities through law enforcement. So, sadly, all of our synagogues, all of our schools have to have police officers there as protection at the entrance, just in case something might happen. And that has been that way for decades. So understanding that, these things could change, but the resources that are necessary, the Jewish community spends an outsized amount on security compared to other religions. And so, I think helping people understand, the challenges the Jewish community faces is the biggest thing, because I've always felt that non-Jewish advocates for the Jewish community are much better than Jewish advocates. People are more, because there's a lot more non-Jews. So they're more likely to listen to you as you express your support for a community, because it doesn't necessarily benefit you, but it shows empathy and it shows respect for others. And that I do believe is very valuable in terms of the advocacy work.
So just kind of getting involved, seeing what is needed.
Exactly. And also from my side, so I work for an advocacy organization, and, we are advocating for the understanding and the definition of what is anti-Semitism. We have this wonderful resource called Translate Hate, which is a glossary of anti-Semitism. People don't often realize that the term globalist is another term for Jew in a negative context. The way that people speak about dual loyalty, they often say that Jews are, they question our loyalty to the United States. Well, that has led to the persecution of Jews for thousands of years. I really believe that there are many ways to support the Jewish community, but it's really understanding the anti-Semitism that exists today is the best way to truly understand and be able to advocate. Because people say, look, I believe that most people who are anti-Semitic not because they hate Jews, but because they are ignorant. They don't understand the challenges that we have faced. And I believe that that's, any chance that we have to sort of help to educate on that is really going to be valuable for us.
I completely agree, because stereotypes and biases just can manifest into microaggressions. So,
yep. Well, it's funny. Microaggressions is a term. You're a little bit younger than me. Microaggressions is something that an older generation doesn't quite understand. But I think there are many microaggressions against Jews that people don't often think about. The scheduling thing on the Jewish holidays is a really big one. The notion of inclusivity for someone who there's very diverse opinions as it relates to support for the state of Israel, and oftentimes people who support Israel are not welcome in certain environments because of their support. So I think it's important for people to understand that there's lots of different ways to be looking at this. And you're right. Stereotypes and biases are really, sadly, they lead to horrible things happening.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And is there anything else you would like to add or that I didn't
Look,
answer? And
no, Deanna, I commend you for this project. I really appreciate your willingness to ask me these questions, to have a conversation about this. We're today we happen to be speaking on the second anniversary of um, the murder of a Jewish woman at a synagogue in Poway,
mm,
California. Right.
oh,
So she was a shooter, walked into a Chabad synagogue and had shot up the synagogue, and one woman was killed. And Jews might not be the group that is murdered most, um,
yeah.
but we have been targeted for being Jews for millennia.
Mm,
We say that anti-Semitism is the oldest form of hatred. So recognizing, and understanding that the Holocaust is just one atrocious event that happened, but
mm-hmm.
frankly, people were persecuted. Jews have been persecuted for literally thousands and thousands of years, and the Holocaust is just sadly one example. Though it's the largest example, but
Mm-hmm.
it is just one example of the type of discrimination that we have faced. So I appreciate your willingness. I mean, we've especially online. I guess the other places, anti-Semitism online is raging. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Facebook is doing a better job of sort of removal of anti-Semitic things,
Fact
but I
checking.
think that's fact checking and denouncing Holocaust now. But I think that's another thing. When you see something on social media that is anti-Semitic, it is absolutely important to report it. I
Mm-hmm.
think that is the way that the algorithms work. You need to report it because otherwise these things will continue to permeate throughout social media and they'll be able to influence others. So
Mm-hmm.
that's, those are some other things that I would recommend too.
Thank you so much.